The night lay thick over the lonely land surrounding Espantosa Lake. A dense fog, thick as wool, crept across the still waters, making it difficult to see where the shore ended and the lake began. The lake had long been a place of whispered warnings, a destination shunned after dark. Travelers quickened their pace on nights like this, the fog wrapping itself around the trees, muting the world around them. The sky, although cloudless, held no moon. Stars twinkled faintly, their distant light barely cutting through the mist. Twisted oak trees and brittle skeletal bushes dotted the shoreline, their forms distorted by the ever-present haze. From somewhere deep within the dark forest came the howl of a wolf, sharp and lonely, piercing the quiet. The sound carried across the water, unnerving anyone who might have been nearby. For generations, the villagers who lived near Espantosa Lake shared unsettling stories about it. Phantoms in the mist, strange cries in the night, shadows that moved where no people were. Animals would often be found mutilated, their remains scattered too close to the water's edge. Sometimes, both animal and human tracks would appear, vanishing abruptly, leaving behind no clue of where they went. Lately, though, things had grown worse. Cattle were disappearing with alarming frequency. Their remains would be found days later, torn apart on the muddy banks. The stories, once only whispered by the old and superstitious, now found their way into every home, into every heart. The village, no longer skeptical, buzzed with fear. Something stalks the lake, they said. Perhaps it's cursed, others whispered. Yet no one dared investigate, not even the bravest of them. Whatever lurked there was beyond their understanding, and it was far safer to keep away. But tonight, Espantosa Lake felt different, almost alive, as if it waited for something, or someone. The mist clung to the trees, drowning out even the softest sounds of the night. Not even the wolves would come close. They remained distant, their presence a shadow in the dark, eyes watching from somewhere deeper within the forest. No one would willingly come near the lake tonight. No one, save for what had already claimed it long ago. The village was only beginning to wake when Tomas stumbled into the square, his face pale, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He couldn't have been more than 12, but the terror in his wide eyes made him seem much older. His hands trembled, clutching at nothing as he tried to speak, his words tumbling over each other in his frantic rush. "I saw her," he panted, his voice breaking. "I saw her by the lake." Those nearby, still groggy from sleep and starting their daily routines, paused to look at the boy. Some stopped sweeping their stoops or wiping down the day's first catch of fish. Gradually, a crowd began to gather around Tomas, drawn in by the panic etched on his face. The boy's words came in hurried bursts. A woman, by the lake. She wasn't wearing anything, and she was with them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Them, in these parts, always meant wolves. The word alone caused unease, a shadow of fear passing over the listeners. Old Mr. Harper, the village blacksmith, knelt in front of Tomas, his voice steady but firm. "Take a breath, lad. Start from the beginning. What did you see?" Tomas swallowed hard, his wide eyes darting from face to face, searching for disbelief. He found none. "I went down to the lake, like always, to gather firewood," he began, his voice trembling. "The mist was thick. I heard something in the trees, something moving. It didn't sound right, not like an animal." He paused, swallowing again, clearly struggling to find the words. "Go on," Harper urged, his weathered hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Tomas lowered his voice to a whisper, forcing the villagers to lean in closer. "I saw her. She was crouched over something. A goat, I think. There was blood everywhere." He winced at the memory. "And there were wolves all around her, watching her, like they were part of her pack." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. "She wasn't afraid of them," Tomas continued. "It was like she was one of them." A woman gasped, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Another crossed herself, muttering something about demons. But the blacksmith kept his eyes on Tomas, his voice unshaken. "And you're sure it was a woman?" Harper asked, as if giving the boy one last chance to change his story. Tomas nodded frantically. "She looked human, but her eyes?" He hesitated. "They weren't right. They looked like a wolf's." A silence fell over the crowd, as heavy as the mist that still clung to the village. They all knew wolves. They feared them, yes, but they understood them. A woman with wolves, though? That was something far more terrifying. Something must be done. a man's voice called from the back, cracking the silence. "We can't have this creature near the village." Others nodded in agreement, their murmurs rising. Fear had taken root. Harper rose slowly, his face hard. "We'll gather a search party. Tonight, but we need to be careful. If this woman can command wolves, we're dealing with more than just an animal." The crowd began to disperse, but the tension remained, clinging to them like the mist. Tomas was quickly whisked away by his mother, her voice sharp as she scolded him for wandering too close to the lake. But even her anger couldn't hide her fear. The boy's words had sparked something in the villagers, an ancient fear of things long forgotten. They had heard stories of wolves and strange figures in the night. But this felt different. As the morning light brightened the sky, the villagers couldn't shake the chill that lingered, nor the sense that they were being watched. Whatever the boy had seen, it had unsettled them all. They knew, as they prepared for the night ahead, that whatever waited by the lake was no ordinary danger. It was something worse. By midday, the elders of the village had gathered in the small wooden church at the town's center. The church, with its creaking floorboards and peeling paint, was the heart of the community, where decisions were made, often with a weight that determined life or death. Today, that weight felt heavier than ever. Harper stood at the front of the gathering, his broad arms crossed over his chest. His face, usually calm and steady, showed a hardness the others rarely saw. "You've all heard what the boy said," he began, his voice low but firm. "Strange things have happened around Espantosa Lake for years. But this is the closest anyone's come to seeing something. We can't ignore it anymore." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room, though some voices wavered with uncertainty. The men gathered here were farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, hard-working, practical people used to dealing with the everyday struggles of village life. But the talk of wolves and a mysterious woman who moved among them had unnerved even the most steadfast. "We've had cattle go missing," Elias, a stout farmer, spoke up. His land bordered the lake, and his worry showed. "And now this? I've lost more goats this year than I can count, always near the water." Father William, the village's thin and aging preacher, shifted uneasily in his seat. His voice was soft, but the words carried weight. "We must consider the possibility that this is not a natural occurrence. If the boy's story is true, if there's a woman living among the wolves, it could be the work of something darker. A curse, perhaps. Or worse." A heavy silence followed his words. No one openly challenged the idea, though many didn't fully believe it. Superstition was embedded deeply here, in this isolated village where nature still ruled over man's efforts to tame it. Though they were men of reason, they had learned never to dismiss forces they couldn't understand. Harper ran a hand over his weathered face. "Whether it's a curse or not, we need to deal with it. This woman, whatever she is a danger. And those wolves, if they're following her, we're dealing with something more than animals." Jacob, one of Harper's younger apprentices at the forge, cleared his throat nervously. "What if we leave her be?" he asked. His voice was soft, hesitant. "She hasn't come into the village. She hasn't harmed anyone but the livestock. Maybe if we don't provoke her, she'll stay away." A few heads nodded in reluctant agreement, but the tension didn't ease. Harper's eyes narrowed. "That's a risk we can't take," he said sharply. "What if she comes closer? What if the wolves get bolder? We've got wives and children to think of. This isn't just about cattle." A heated discussion followed, voices rising and falling as the men debated the best course of action. Some sided with Jacob, fearful of provoking whatever dark force might be at play. Others, like Elias and Harper, were adamant that something had to be done before it was too late. The preacher, who had remained quiet for most of the debate, finally stood, his voice cutting through the room with a calm authority. "We cannot allow fear to paralyze us," Father William said. "We must face this threat head-on. We'll go to the lake tonight, find this woman, and see the truth for ourselves. If she is human, we will help her, remove her from the wolves. And if she is something else," his voice darkened, "we will do what we must to protect our people." The room fell into a deep, heavy silence, but there was no disagreement. The decision had been made. The men would prepare to search the lake, armed and ready for whatever they might find. As the council broke apart, word spread quickly throughout the village. The men gathered their weapons, rifles, knives, torches, while the women moved quickly to secure their homes and prepare meals for the searchers. The tension in the air was palpable, a quiet kind of panic that simmered just below the surface, though no one dared speak it aloud. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, and with it the first tendrils of mist began creeping in from the lake. The village, usually filled with the hum of activity, fell quiet as the fear settled in for the night. Tonight, they would face the unknown. As dusk fell, a group of 10 men gathered at the edge of the village, each face set in grim determination. Harper stood at the front, his muscular arms crossed as he inspected the rifles and knives the men carried. The mist had already begun to creep in from the lake, and by the time night fully took hold, the entire area would be blanketed in thick fog. The men exchanged nervous whispers, their words barely audible over the heavy silence of the approaching night. Even the usual evening sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were absent, swallowed by the growing mist. Fear gnawed at their hearts, though none of them would admit it aloud. Wolves, they knew how to handle. They could be hunted, tracked, and killed. But what they were hunting tonight was something else, something that felt far beyond their understanding. "We'll head out while there's still some light left," Harper said, his voice gruff. "Stay together. No one wanders off, and no one takes chances. We're not out here for sport. This is survival. If we see her, we don't hesitate. We take her down. Understood?" The men nodded, though some paled at the thought. Jacob, the youngest of the group, shuffled nervously, his eyes darting between the older, more seasoned men. He had grown up on tales of monsters lurking in the woods, but until tonight, he had never truly believed any of them. Now, standing on the edge of the forest with a rifle in hand, those stories felt far too real. Without another word, the group set off, their footsteps barely audible on the dry ground. The torches flickered as they moved, casting long shadows that danced behind them. The mist clung to their legs like cold fingers, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The closer they got to the lake, the thicker the fog became, turning the world around them into a ghostly blur of shadows and faint shapes. Elias, walking just behind Harper, muttered under his breath, "This place has always given me the creeps. Should have built the village farther from the lake." Harper grunted in agreement, but his eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. The lake was just beyond the trees now, its surface barely visible through the fog. It stretched out like a black mirror, reflecting nothing but the night itself. The men spread out, keeping close but leaving enough distance to cover more ground. Harper led them toward the spot where Tomas had claimed to see the woman, his sharp eyes scanning the ground for any sign of movement. The mist muffled every sound, making even the crack of a twig or the rustle of leaves feel ominous. They searched for nearly an hour, their nerves on edge, but found nothing. No wolves, no sign of the woman. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. Every so often, a man would pause, thinking he heard something, a faint rustling, a soft footfall. But when they looked, there was only silence. Just as Harper was about to call for a regroup, Jacob froze, his voice barely a whisper. "Harper, over there, I think I see something." The group followed his gaze, peering through the fog. At first, it was difficult to make out, just a shadow moving between the trees. But as they strained their eyes, the shape came into focus. A woman, hunched over, her long hair tangled and wild, her body crouched low. Harper's heart quickened. There she was. "She's real," Elias whispered, disbelief heavy in his voice. "God help us, she's real." Harper raised his rifle slowly, signaling the others to do the same. They moved cautiously, careful not to make a sound. As they approached, the faint sound of bones snapping reached their ears. The woman was crouched over something, tearing into it. Flesh, blood. A goat, just like Tomas had described. "Surround her," Harper ordered, his voice low. "Don't let her escape." The men fanned out, forming a wide circle around the woman, but she didn't seem to notice. She remained focused on her gruesome task, the wolves standing silently at her side, watching her as if they were waiting for her next command. They were close now, close enough to see her clearly. Her hair hung over her face in dirty tangles, her hands slick with blood. The wolves stood still, their eyes glowing eerily in the dark, but their attention was fixed solely on her. Just as Harper was about to give the signal to close in, the woman's head snapped up, her yellow, wolf-like eyes locking onto them. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air itself felt thick and heavy, charged with something unnatural. And then she moved. Faster than any of them expected, the woman bolted toward the trees, her body darting into the mist with an agility that no human should possess. The wolves followed in a blur, their dark shapes disappearing into the night. The men fired their rifles, the loud cracks of gunfire shattering the silence, but it was too late. The woman and her wolves were gone. Harper lowered his rifle, cursing under his breath. Damn it, we had her. Elias scanned the trees, his face pale. What now? She's out there, and we don't know where. We keep going, Harper growled, though his voice held less certainty now. We can't let her keep terrorizing the village. If we don't stop her tonight, there's no telling what she'll do next. The men regrouped, their fear palpable, but they had no choice. They had come face to face with the woman Tomas had described, and she was no mere legend. She was real, and she was dangerous. As they continued deeper into the forest, the mist seemed to close in around them, growing thicker with every step. The woman was out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows. And now they knew for certain, they were not the hunters. They were the hunted. The night grew colder as the group pressed further into the forest, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. Harper walked at the front, his eyes sharp, his focus unwavering, though he could feel the tension growing behind him. The fog wrapped itself around them like a living thing, thickening as they ventured deeper into the woods, distorting every shadow. She's out there, Elias muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. I can feel her watching us. Harper didn't reply, but he knew Elias was right. The woman, if she even was a woman, had eluded them once already with unnatural speed and grace. There was something about the way she moved, something that gnawed at him. He wasn't a man prone to superstition, but what he had seen tonight made the old stories feel all too real. The forest around them was eerily quiet. The trees grew thicker here, their twisted branches blocking out the faint light of the stars, leaving only darkness. Even the usual sounds of the forest, owls hooting, wolves howling, were absent. It felt as though the very woods were holding their breath. Jacob, near the back of the group, whispered to the man beside him, "What if she's leading us into a trap?" The question hung in the air, unspoken but weighing heavily on all of them. It was a thought none of them wanted to entertain, but it was impossible to ignore. Every step they took felt like it was drawing them deeper into her territory, as though they were walking straight into her lair. Suddenly, Harper raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. Up ahead, something moved in the mist, a flicker of motion, too fast to fully see. The men froze, their breath catching in their throats as they strained their eyes to make out the shape. There she was, standing in a small clearing just beyond the reach of their torchlight. The woman stood tall, her hair wild and untamed, her body silhouetted by the faint light. The wolves, who had been absent all night, now flanked her on either side, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. They moved silently, their sleek bodies tense, watching the men with unblinking eyes. The men gripped their rifles, aiming at the woman and her wolves, but Harper held up a hand, urging caution. There was something about the way she stood there, so still, as though she was waiting for them to make the first move. For a long moment, no one moved. The wolves growled softly, their eyes locked on the group of intruders. The woman remained motionless, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. And then, without warning, she stepped forward, her bare feet moving soundlessly over the ground. "Stop!" Harper barked, raising his rifle. His voice was steady, but inside his heart was racing. The woman didn't stop. She took another step, then another. The wolves followed her, their heads low, teeth bared, but they made no move to attack. The men exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Should they fire? Should they run? "Don't come any closer," Elias shouted, his finger trembling on the trigger. Still, she came closer, her face becoming clearer in the dim torchlight. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, those yellow, animalistic eyes, glinted in the dark, wild and feral. Yet, there was something else in them, something almost human. "Who are you?" Harper demanded, his voice hard. "What do you want?" The woman tilted her head slightly as if considering his question. Her lips parted as though she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that made the blood run cold in their veins. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and disappeared into the fog, her wolves following silently behind her. For a moment, the men stood frozen, stunned by what they had just witnessed. Harper cursed under his breath, lowering his rifle. "She's playing with us." "What the hell was that?" Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Harper admitted, his brow furrowed in frustration. "But she's not just some woman lost in the woods. She's something else, something unnatural." Elias's voice was shaky. "We can't fight her, not like this. She's too fast, too strong, and those wolves, they'll tear us apart." Harper nodded grimly. "We'll head back, for now. But this isn't over. We need to regroup, come back with more men, more firepower if we have to. We can't let her run free." The men slowly began to retreat, their steps cautious, eyes scanning the dark forest for any sign of movement. The mist seemed to thicken as they moved, closing in around them, swallowing the clearing where the woman had stood moments before. The wolves and their strange leader were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Harper's mind raced as they made their way back toward the village. They had come face to face with the woman wolf, and now they knew she was no myth. She was real, and she was hunting them as surely as they were hunting her. The men returned to the village just before dawn, their faces pale and drawn, their movements slow, burdened by the weight of what they had seen. Though they had come face to face with the woman, they had nothing to show for it. The thick mist still clung to the village like an unwelcome guest, making it seem as though the night refused to fully let go. Harper led the group to the village square, where a handful of women and older men had gathered, anxiously awaiting their return. As soon as they saw the men approach, the questions spilled out. "Did you find her? Is she dead? What about the wolves?" Harper raised a hand to silence them. "We found her," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we didn't capture her, not yet." Confusion spread through the crowd, mixed with fear. Father William, standing on the church steps, made his way toward the group, his thin face shadowed with concern. "What happened?" he asked. Harper looked to the others, all of them still shaken from the encounter in the forest. Finally he spoke. "She's not just a woman. There's something wrong with her. She moves like an animal, and she commands the wolves. She's not afraid of them. They obey her." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some made the sign of the cross, while others exchanged worried glances. Father William's face darkened. "Witchcraft," he muttered. "This is what I feared." "We can't let her stay out there," Harper said, his voice firm now. "If she's controlling those wolves, it's only a matter of time before she comes closer to the village. We need to trap her, contain her before it's too late." The crowd fell silent, listening to Harper's words with a growing sense of dread. The idea of a woman who could control wolves, who moved like a creature of the wild, was terrifying enough. But the thought of her roaming free in the forest, unchecked, was even worse. "There's an old shack near the edge of the woods," Harper continued, addressing the group. "It hasn't been used in years, but it's strong enough to hold her, at least until we figure out what to do next. We'll bait her, lure her inside, and lock her up." The men nodded in agreement, though their faces betrayed their unease. It was a desperate plan, but it was the best one they had. By mid-morning, preparations were underway. Harper and Elias led a small group of men to the shack, which stood in a clearing not far from the village. It was old, its wooden walls weathered and gray, but it was sturdy. The men worked quickly, reinforcing the door with iron bars and covering the windows with thick planks. They rigged a net at the entrance, one that would drop as soon as the woman stepped inside. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could manage on such short notice. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the trap was set. Harper gathered the men around him, their faces tense, their eyes focused. "Tonight," Harper said, "we bring her in. We'll lure her to the shack, trap her, and lock her inside. No one goes in alone. No one takes any chances. We don't know what she's capable of." The men set out as the last light of day faded, the mist once again creeping in from the lake. The air was heavy with anticipation, and every step felt like it was carrying them closer to something dark, something unknown. They carried rifles, ropes, and nets, determined not to let the woman escape again. When they reached the clearing, they fanned out, taking up positions around the shack. Elias carried the bait, a freshly slaughtered goat, its carcass still bleeding. The plan was simple: leave the goat in front of the shack and wait. If the woman was as wild as they believed, the smell of fresh blood would draw her out. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the low growl of wolves echoed through the trees, followed by the soft sound of paws on the ground. The wolves were coming. Harper signaled for the men to stay hidden, crouching behind trees and rocks, their eyes fixed on the clearing. The mist swirled around them, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, through the fog, she appeared. The woman wolf emerged from the trees, her yellow eyes gleaming in the torchlight. The wolves flanked her, their teeth bared, but they moved cautiously, as though sensing something was wrong. She stepped forward, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of the goat. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes sweeping the clearing, as if she knew she was being watched. Then, slowly, she approached the goat. Harper held his breath as she crouched over the carcass, her hands stained with blood as she began to tear into the flesh. She was so close to the shack now, just a few more feet. One of the wolves barked sharply, its head snapping toward the trees. The woman froze, her body tensing as she turned toward the sound. Harper's heart pounded in his chest. Had they been spotted? But before the wolves could react, the woman bolted for the shack, dragging the goat's carcass with her. The net dropped as planned, tangling around her. She thrashed wildly, her growls turning into sharp guttural snarls. But the men rushed forward, pulling the net tighter around her, pinning her to the ground. "Get her inside," Harper shouted, his voice urgent. With great effort, the men dragged the struggling woman into the shack, slamming the iron-barred door behind her. Her howls of rage echoed through the night, a sound so feral and wild that it sent chills down their spines. The wolves outside paced and growled, but they didn't dare approach. For now, the woman wolf was trapped. Night had fully settled over the village by the time the men returned from the woods. Harper led the group, his thoughts heavy as they made their way back to the square. They had done it, trapped the woman wolf in the old shack. The threat for the moment was contained, but even as the men exchanged nervous congratulations, there was an unease hanging in the air. Elias, walking beside Harper, glanced at him. "We've done it," he said, though his voice lacked the relief one might expect. "She's locked up tight. She won't be able to hurt anyone now." Harper grunted in response, his gaze fixed ahead, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. Something about it all didn't sit right with him. He had seen the look in the woman's eyes, those sharp, feral eyes that glinted in the darkness. There had been more than just rage in them. There had been intelligence, and that scared him more than the wolves. As they entered the village, a small group of people awaited them in the square, their faces anxious. When they saw the men return unscathed, there was a collective sigh of relief. Father William approached, his eyes scanning the group. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Harper nodded. "She's in the shack, locked up. For now, the village is safe." The crowd relaxed, though the tension never fully left their faces. Father William's brow furrowed. "And the wolves?" "They're still out there," Harper replied. "But they didn't attack, not after we trapped her." The priest nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Good. For now, we've contained the evil. But we must remain vigilant. Darkness like this does not die easily." The men dispersed, eager to return to their homes, to the comfort of their families. But Harper remained uneasy. Something gnawed at the back of his mind, a nagging sense that they hadn't truly won. He couldn't shake the image of her, how she had fought against the ropes, her strength unnatural. How her eyes had glowed in the dark with something primal and unstoppable. Inside the shack, the woman wolf lay still, her body bound in the net. Her chest rose and fell with deep, labored breaths, but her mind was not at rest. The ropes cut into her skin, but the pain barely registered. Her thoughts, though clouded by the animal instincts that had overtaken her, remained sharp. She knew she was trapped, confined in this small, suffocating space. The wolves outside paced restlessly, their howls echoing faintly in the night. She could feel them, sense their frustration. They were bound to her, their loyalty deeper than mere animal instinct. But they were powerless to help her now. Hours passed in silence. The village was quiet, the men satisfied that their trap had worked. They believed they had captured her. They were wrong. The woman stirred, her eyes flickering open. The transformation that had begun in her so long ago was now complete. She was no longer bound by the limits of the human body. Her connection to the wolves had strengthened her, turned her into something more, something wild, something free. And no shack, no iron bars could hold her. Slowly, she flexed her muscles, testing the ropes that bound her. They groaned under the pressure, but held firm. Her lips curled into a snarl. They thought they could contain her. They didn't understand. With a sudden surge of strength, she twisted against the ropes, her body straining as the fibers stretched and snapped. One by one, the ropes broke, falling to the floor as she rose to her feet. She stretched, feeling the power coursing through her veins, her body humming with energy. The iron-barred door stood in front of her, thick and reinforced. But she was no longer just a woman. With a guttural growl, she stepped forward, her fingers curling around the cold metal. The bars groaned under her grip, bending slightly but resisting her strength. She growled again, louder this time, her rage building. Outside, the wolves howled in unison, their cries carrying on the wind. They could sense her, feel her power. The woman's growl deepened into a roar, and with a final violent tug, the iron bars twisted and snapped. The door wrenched free from its hinges, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. She was free. The night welcomed her as she stepped out of the shack, her wolves gathering around her. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting the faint light of the moon that had broken through the mist. She didn't look back at the village. Her mind was no longer clouded by thoughts of revenge or fear. She was driven by instinct now, by the call of the wild. With a low, rumbling growl, she turned and disappeared into the forest, her wolves close behind. The village lay quiet in the distance, still unaware of her escape. But it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Morning broke gently over the village, casting a soft, golden light on the rooftops. The mist from the night before had lifted, leaving behind a false sense of calm. Villagers went about their routines, as if the events of the previous night were just a bad dream. But the men who had trapped the woman-wolf knew better. A heaviness hung over them, unspoken yet unmistakable. Harper was at the forge when Elias and 2 others came running from the edge of the village, their faces pale with dread. Harper saw them approaching and immediately knew something was wrong. He set his tools aside, his heart quickening. "She's gone," Elias panted, stopping in front of Harper. His voice was tight with disbelief. "The shack's empty." Harper straightened up, wiping his hands on his apron. "What do you mean, gone? How could she be gone?" "The door," Elias said, shaking his head. "It's been torn clean off. The bars are twisted like straw. She broke out sometime last night or early this morning. And the wolves, there's no sign of them either." Harper felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He had feared this, deep down. Feared that the shack would not be enough to hold her. That she was stronger than they had anticipated. He cursed under his breath. "Show me," he ordered, striding toward the edge of the village, Elias and the others following close behind. When they reached the clearing where the shack stood, Harper's worst fears were confirmed. The iron door lay on the ground, twisted and broken. Inside, the ropes that had bound her were torn apart. The place reeked of blood and anger. Tracks led away from the shack, vanishing into the deeper parts of the forest, where even the most experienced hunters dared not tread. The wolves had gone with her, leaving no trace of where they had gone. The news spread quickly through the village, igniting a wildfire of panic. People gathered in the square, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Conversations buzzed with the growing realization that the woman-wolf was no longer contained. "If she escaped," one woman said, clutching her shawl tight, "it means she'll come back. And this time, she won't just go after the animals." Others nodded, their voices trembling with dread. Father William, who had warned them about the dangers of witchcraft, stood before the crowd, his thin frame silhouetted against the morning light. "This is no ordinary woman," he declared, his voice rising above the anxious murmurs. "This is the work of the devil himself. She is a creature of darkness, sent to test us. We must pray for protection, for deliverance from this evil. But prayers offered little comfort to the villagers. The fear had settled deep into their bones, a primal terror that nothing could shake. Harper, standing on the outskirts of the crowd, exchanged a grim look with Elias. "We need to track her," Harper said, his voice low. "Find out where she's gone." Elias nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes mirrored Harper's own doubt. "And then what?" he asked. "What if we find her?" Harper didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what they could do, even if they found her. They had trapped her once, and it had failed. The shack, their strongest hope of containing her, had proven useless. Now, she was out there, somewhere in the wilderness, with her wolves. What could they possibly do to fight something they barely understood? "We'll organize a search party," Harper said at last, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "We can't just leave her out there. If she comes back, we'll be ready." The village buzzed with preparation as word spread of the search. The men gathered their weapons, rifles, knives, anything that might help them if they faced the woman wolf again. The women barricaded their homes, tending to livestock and children with shaking hands. There was a strange, hollow quiet in the air, broken only by the occasional whispered prayer or the rustle of wind through the trees. By the time Harper and the others set out to track her, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They followed the trail of tracks left by the wolves, but it soon vanished into the thick undergrowth of the forest. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed their path. Hours passed as they searched the outskirts of the forest, but there was no sign of her. The deeper parts of the woods, where the shadows grew longer and the air thicker, remained untouched. Even the bravest among them hesitated to venture too far in. As the sun began to set, the group returned to the village, empty-handed and defeated. The tension in the village was palpable, fear hovering in the air like the mist that crept in once more from Espantosa Lake. "She's gone," Elias muttered as he and Harper stood at the edge of the village, staring out into the trees. "It's like she disappeared into thin air." "Or she's waiting," Harper replied, his voice grim. The two men stood in silence as the last light of the day faded from the sky, the night creeping in around them. Harper knew that this wasn't the end. The woman wolf had escaped once, and now she was free, somewhere out there in the shadows beyond the village. It was only a matter of time before she returned. As night descended once again, the village became cloaked in an oppressive silence. The earlier relief that had followed the woman wolf's capture had long evaporated, leaving only fear in its wake. Though the sky was clear, with stars scattered across the dark heavens, the villagers felt as if something unseen was looming, hiding just out of sight. Harper sat on the front porch of his small home, his rifle resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the lengthening shadows that stretched across the square. The events of the previous days weighed heavily on him. He hadn't slept properly since they had first set out to find the woman, and tonight was no different. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to let him rest. The wolves, too, had fallen silent. Not a single howl broke the night air, and that silence was even more unnerving. Every creak of wood, every snap of a twig made the tension in Harper's muscles tighten. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Across the village, doors had been bolted, windows shuttered. The villagers huddled inside their homes, fearing what might come from the woods once darkness fully set in. They knew the wolves were still out there. Worse, they knew the woman wolf was somewhere, waiting. The silence didn't last long. Not long after night had fully claimed the village, a deep, bone-chilling howl pierced the air. It came from the forest, far off but unmistakable. It wasn't a normal wolf's cry. It was something deeper, something more primal. The sound echoed through the village, making the hairs on the back of Harper's neck stand on end. Before long, more howls followed, closer this time. The wolves had returned. From within the homes, lights flickered on as the villagers realized what was happening. Some began to cry out in panic, their fear palpable. Harper stood, his rifle at the ready, his heart pounding in his chest. The wolves were back, but it wasn't the wolves that scared him. It was the certainty that their leader, the woman wolf, was with them. Elias arrived, breathless, a rifle slung over his shoulder. He glanced at Harper, his face pale in the dim light. "You hear that?" he asked. "She's coming." Harper nodded, his jaw set. "We knew it was a possibility." Elias glanced nervously toward the forest. What do we do? We can't fight them out in the open, not with her leading them. We defend the village, Harper replied, though his voice was low, almost a growl. We stick together, stay near the houses. If she comes at us again with the wolves, we'll have to hold our ground. The howls grew louder, closer. The men of the village began to gather near the square, each of them gripping rifles, pitchforks, or anything they could use as a weapon. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting nervously between the trees. Every one of them remembered what had happened the last time they faced her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the village, followed by the panicked cries of animals. Harper spun toward the sound, his heart skipping a beat. What was that? The livestock pens, Elias said, already running toward the noise. The wolves. They're after the animals. Harper followed close behind, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. As they reached the pens, the sight that greeted them was chaos. Wolves had broken through the wooden fencing, their dark forms darting between the terrified goats and horses. In the flickering lantern light, Harper could see the glint of their yellow eyes, their teeth bared as they snarled and snapped at the animals. "Back off!" Harper shouted, raising his rifle. He fired a shot into the air, the sharp crack echoing through the night. A few wolves paused, their ears twitching at the sound, but they didn't retreat. Elias and the others raised their rifles, firing off warning shots, but the wolves were relentless. They weren't just hunting, they were attacking. And then Harper saw her. Standing just beyond the pens, half hidden by the shadows of the trees, was the woman wolf. Her wild hair framed her pale face, her yellow eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. She didn't move toward them, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone seemed to drive the wolves into a frenzy, pushing them forward. Harper's blood ran cold. She was here, as real as ever, commanding her pack with nothing but her presence. There was no sign of the shack, no ropes, no chains, nothing could hold her now. "Fall back," Harper shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. "Everyone, back to the village." The men retreated, firing their rifles as they went, trying to fend off the wolves. But the animals were relentless, surging forward with a fury Harper had never seen before. One of the younger men tripped, his foot catching on a rock, and before Harper could reach him, a wolf lunged, knocking him to the ground. The man screamed as the wolf's jaws clamped down on his leg. Harper fired, the shot hitting the wolf square in the side. It yelped, releasing its grip and darting back into the darkness. Elias and another man grabbed the injured villager, pulling him to his feet and dragging him back toward the village as the wolves circled, their glowing eyes watching. They couldn't hold them off forever. Harper knew it. The wolves were too many, and the woman too powerful. He cast one last glance at the woman wolf, still standing in the shadows, her eyes locked on him. She didn't move, but the smile on her lips chilled him to his core. "We can't fight them like this," Elias gasped as they reached the square. "She's controlling them. There are too many." Harper nodded grimly. "Barricade the village. We need to hold them off until morning." The villagers, alerted by the gunfire and the howls, began to move frantically. Harper shouted orders, directing them to reinforce their homes, to block off the entrances to the village. They worked quickly, but the fear was thick in the air. They knew the wolves were coming for them, and they didn't know if they could survive the night. As Harper stood at the edge of the square, his rifle still in hand, he looked out toward the forest. The wolves had retreated for now, but he could feel the woman wolf's presence out there, lurking just beyond the light. The fear that had taken root in the village had returned, stronger than ever. And this time, it wouldn't leave until something, or someone, was dead. The night stretched on, heavy with dread. The villagers huddled in their homes, their doors bolted and windows shuttered. The men stood watch at the village's edges, rifles ready, eyes scanning the shadows. But nothing moved. The howls had faded, leaving a thick, oppressive silence in their place. Harper paced near the village entrance, his rifle still in hand, his thoughts racing. The wolves had attacked, but now they had gone quiet. It didn't sit right with him. The silence felt wrong, unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. He didn't know how much longer they could hold out. The fear among the villagers had grown to a fever pitch. They had prepared for a fight, but they all knew deep down that they were facing something beyond their understanding. Elias approached Harper, his face grim, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "We can't hold them off forever," he muttered, his eyes scanning the dark forest beyond the village. "We've reinforced everything, but if she comes at us again with those wolves..." "I know," Harper replied, his voice low, "but we're not giving up. We'll hold out until morning, then we'll regroup. We have to. There's no other choice." But deep down, Harper knew it wasn't just about surviving the night. The woman wolf wasn't like anything they had ever faced. She was more than human, more than an animal. She was something else entirely, something wild, something dangerous. And they had no idea how to stop her. The hours dragged by. The cold night deepened, and the mist began to roll in again from Espantosa Lake, curling around the trees and blanketing the ground in a heavy, ghostly fog. Harper and the men kept their watch, rifles gripped tightly, their nerves taut. Every now and then, they would hear the faintest rustle in the trees, just enough to keep them on edge. But the attack never came. As dawn finally broke, casting a pale, weak light over the village, the wolves were nowhere to be seen. The forest was still, almost too still, as though nothing had ever happened. Harper stood at the village entrance, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The mist had receded slightly, revealing the distant, foreboding outline of the forest. But there was no movement, no sign of the woman wolf or her pack. "She's gone," Elias said quietly, coming to stand beside Harper. "She took the wolves and left." Harper shook his head. "Not gone," he muttered. "She's still out there, waiting." As the village began to wake, people emerged cautiously from their homes, unsure if the danger had truly passed. Some were reluctant to leave the safety of their barricades, while others gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed tones about what had happened. But no one knew for sure. Father William, his face lined with worry, approached Harper. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "We can't live in fear forever." "We keep watch," Harper replied. "We prepare. If she comes back, we'll be ready. But for now, there's not much else we can do." The villagers slowly returned to their daily routines, but it was clear that nothing was the same. The threat of the woman wolf still lingered, a dark shadow over their lives. The wolves, too, had become more than just a nuisance. They had become a symbol of the fear that now gripped the entire village. Weeks passed, and although the wolves had been spotted occasionally at the edge of the forest, they never ventured close to the village. The woman wolf herself was nowhere to be seen. Yet, despite her absence, the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching them. Waiting. The story of the woman wolf quickly spread through the village, turning from fact into legend. Parents told their children to stay away from the lake after dark, warning them of the woman who lived among the wolves, who watched from the shadows. The tale grew in the telling, becoming more ominous with each retelling. She became more than just a mysterious figure. She became a living myth, a legend that haunted their dreams. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, casting long shadows across the water, Tomas, the boy who had first seen her, came running into the village, his face pale, his breath ragged. "I saw her," he cried, pointing back toward the lake. "I saw her again, by the trees." Harper and Elias exchanged a glance before grabbing their rifles and following Tomas to the water's edge. The other villagers, too curious to stay behind, followed at a distance, whispering nervously. When they reached the lake, Tomas pointed to a spot just beyond the tree line where the forest met the water. "She was standing there," he said, his voice breathless with fear and excitement. "Right there. I swear it." Harper scanned the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing. The mist hung low over the lake, swirling gently in the fading light, but there was no sign of the woman wolf. The villagers stood in silence, their eyes locked on the trees, waiting for something to happen. But nothing moved. The air was still. "She's still out there," one of the older women muttered, clutching her shawl tightly around her. "She'll come back, mark my words." Harper stood at the edge of the lake, his rifle resting against his shoulder. The boy might have seen her, or maybe it was his fear playing tricks on him. Either way, Harper knew the truth. The woman wolf was still out there, somewhere in the shadows of the forest, watching, waiting. The legend of the woman wolf would live on, just as she did, wild, untamed, and always watching from the dark. The village would never be the same.